Boss 429 versus Pontiac GTO Judge, Muscle Car Showdown. Your buddy thought he was hot stuff when he rolled up in that Orbit Orange GTO Judge, those wild "The Judge" decals screaming down the sides like something from a Saturday morning cartoon. That Ram Air hood scoop was pointing skyward like it was ready for takeoff, and he was revving that Pontiac 400 just to make sure everyone on the block knew he'd bought the wildest thing ever to roll off a Detroit assembly line. Then your neighbor's kid came home from college driving his dad's Boss 429 Mustang, and suddenly that Judge didn't look quite so intimidating. This is the story of two completely different philosophies about what made a muscle car great. Pontiac's wild child that looked like it escaped from a comic book versus Ford's hand-built NASCAR weapon that cost more than some people's houses. The outrageous street fighter against the exclusive racing machine. Here's what's going to shock you. One of these cars could consistently embarrass the other at every drag strip in America, but it wasn't the one everyone expected. And wait until you hear what happened when the magazines finally got both cars on the same track for a head-to-head comparison. The GTO Judge wasn't born in some corporate boardroom where executives worried about image and respectability. This was Pontiac's middle finger to anyone who thought muscle cars should be subtle, conservative, or grown up. Your typical muscle car in 1969 came in respectable colors like black, white, or maybe a nice blue. Pontiac said forget that noise and created Orbit Orange, a color so bright NASA probably tracked it on radar. They didn't stop there. They slapped the Judge decals down the sides in letters big enough to read from 3 lanes away. The Judge started as Pontiac's answer to Plymouth's budget Roadrunner, but somewhere during development, the engineers got carried away. Instead of building a cheap muscle car, they created something that looked like Hot Wheels had come to life. That rear spoiler wasn't there for aerodynamics. It was there to let everyone know you'd stopped caring what the neighbors thought. Walking up to a Judge felt like approaching something that had escaped from a drag strip. The Ram Air hood with those twin scoops looked ready to inhale small children. And when the owner fired it up, that distinctive Pontiac rumble could wake the dead 2 counties over. But here's what separated the Judge from other flashy muscle cars. Underneath all that cartoon wildness was serious mechanical business that could back up every outrageous claim painted on the sides. While Pontiac was building wild street cars, Ford was trying to solve a completely different problem. Their racing engineers were getting embarrassed by Chrysler's Hemi engines in NASCAR, and Ford's response was the 429 Boss, a magnificent piece of engineering that flowed air like a hurricane. NASCAR rules said you had to build 500 street versions to make your racing engine legal. Ford could have put this monster in the Galaxy or Torino they actually raced, but somebody in Dearborn had a different idea. Let's stuff it in a Mustang, they said. That'll really show everyone we mean serious business. The 429 was so massive that Ford had to completely re-engineer the Mustang just to make it fit. They cut shock towers, relocated suspension components, moved the battery to the trunk, and basically hand-built every single car at CarCraft in Brighton, Michigan. At $4,172, a Boss 429 cost serious money. More than a new Corvette, more than most people made in a year. Ford only built 859 of them in 1969 and 499 more in 1970. These weren't cars you could walk into any dealer and order. They were limited edition masterpieces that required special connections just to see one. When your friend's dad finally brought one home, the whole neighborhood came out to look. That massive shaker hood scoop dominated the engine bay, and when he fired it up, the sound was pure NASCAR fury, barely contained by mufflers. Everyone assumed this hand-built racing machine would dominate everything on the road. That assumption was about to get seriously tested. Here's where things get interesting, and where Ford probably wishes the magazines had minded their own business. When Car and Driver tested a Boss 429, they managed 14.09 seconds in the quarter mile at 102 miles per hour. Motor Trend did slightly better with 13.9 seconds, but both magazines noted the same thing. For a hand-built racing engine, the Boss felt surprisingly lazy off the line. Meanwhile, Hot Rod Magazine got their hands on a GTO Judge with the standard Ram Air 3 engine and recorded 14.45 seconds at 98 miles per hour. Not earth-shattering, but remember, this was the base engine in a car that cost significantly less than the Boss. Then Superstock and Drag Illustrated tested a Judge with the optional Ram Air 4 engine, and the results made Ford engineers question everything they thought they knew about street performance. The Judge ran 13.58 seconds at 105.5 miles per hour, consistently outrunning the Boss 429 while costing about $500 less. The real embarrassment came when both cars showed up at the same drag strip on the same night. Your buddy in the Judge was running consistent 13.6 seconds, while the Boss 429 owner was struggling to break into the 13s. Word spread quickly through the muscle car community that Pontiac's Wild Child was outrunning Ford's hand-built masterpiece. But the performance gap wasn't the only surprise in this showdown. The Boss 429's problem started with Ford's basic approach to the project. They'd built a pure racing engine designed to run wide open at Daytona and Talladega, then tried to make it civilized enough for your average weekend warrior to drive to work. Racing engines don't care about idle quality, emissions compliance, or pump gas compatibility. They're designed to make maximum power at high RPM for hours at a time. When Ford tried to make the 429 street legal, they had to compromise everything that made it special. The compression ratio got dropped from race specification to something that wouldn't destroy pistons on pump gas. The wild camshaft got tamed for smooth idling and neighborhood-friendly exhaust notes. The carburation got sized for fuel economy rather than maximum airflow. What you ended up with was an engine that made impressive power at 6,000 RPM but felt disappointingly sluggish everywhere a street driver would actually use it. The Boss 429 was happiest above 4,500 RPM, which meant it felt lazy at stoplights and unimpressive during normal driving. Even worse was the weight problem. That massive 429 engine made the Mustang seriously nose-heavy, which hurt both acceleration and handling. Ford tried to compensate with suspension modifications, but you can't cheat physics. A nose-heavy car doesn't launch as well as a balanced one, and it certainly doesn't handle worth a damn. Your typical Boss 429 owner discovered they'd bought the most expensive Mustang Ford ever built, and it couldn't outrun cars costing half as much. Pontiac's approach with the Judge was completely different, and it explains why the car succeeded where Ford's masterpiece failed. Instead of trying to tame a race engine for the street, Pontiac built street engines that happened to make serious power. The Ram Air engines started as production power plants designed for real-world driving. The compression ratios were aggressive, but not crazy. The camshafts were hot, but still allowed smooth idling and decent drivability in traffic. Most importantly, these engines made their power in the RPM range where people actually drove. The Ram Air 3 that came standard in the Judge made 366 horsepower and 445 pound-feet of torque, with a power band that kicked in around 2,500 RPM and pulled hard to 5,500. This meant the car felt strong everywhere you'd use it, from stoplight launches to highway passing. The optional Ram Air 4 was even more impressive, officially rated at 370 horsepower, but actually making closer to 390. Unlike the Boss 429, which needed to be wound up to make power, the Ram Air 4 delivered massive torque right off idle and never stopped pulling. Pontiac also understood weight distribution. The 400 cubic inch engine was big enough to make serious power, but small enough to fit naturally in the GTO platform without requiring major modifications. The result was a car that launched hard, handled reasonably well, and delivered consistent performance whether you were cruising to the drive-in or terrorizing the local drag strip. Best of all, you could walk into any Pontiac dealer and order one. No special connections required, no waiting lists, no astronomical prices. The Judge was accessible performance for anyone brave enough to be seen in Orbit Orange. By 1970, the underground street racing scene had delivered its verdict, and it wasn't kind to Ford's hand-built masterpiece. Judges were becoming legends at drag strips across America, consistently running times that made other muscle car owners question their automotive choices. The Judge developed a reputation as the giant killer, the car that looked like a cartoon but could embarrass anything foolish enough to line up next to it. Word spread through the muscle car community that the wildest-looking car on the road was also one of the fastest. Boss 429 owners, meanwhile, were learning expensive lessons about the difference between racing credentials and street performance. These cars were becoming garage queens, beautiful to look at, but disappointing to drive. The few owners who understood how to extract performance from the 429 could make them competitive, but it required skills most street racers didn't possess. Your typical Friday night at the local drag strip told the story. Judges were running consistent 13.6 seconds with bone stock engines and street tires. Boss 429s were struggling to break 14 seconds without serious modifications and tuning. The hand-built racing machine was being consistently outrun by the mass-produced Street Fighter. The magazines caught on quickly. Road Test called the Judge the most honest muscle car we've ever tested, while noting that the Boss 429 promises more than it delivers. Hot Rod was even more brutal, stating that the Judge makes the Boss 429 look like an expensive mistake. The 429's failure wasn't about bad engineering. It was about building the wrong car for the market Ford was trying to serve. The muscle car era was about accessible performance, cars that any working guy could afford and enjoy. Ford built an exclusive, expensive machine that required expert knowledge to extract its potential. Ford's marketing department also oversold what they'd created. They positioned the Boss 429 as the ultimate street fighter when it was actually a compromised race engine that happened to be street legal. When magazines started testing the car and getting mediocre results, Ford's credibility took a hit that lasted for years. The pricing strategy made things worse. At over $4,000, the Boss 429 cost serious money in an era when most muscle cars sold for under $3,500. Ford was asking customers to pay premium prices for disappointing performance, and the market responded predictably. Your average muscle car buyer looked at the numbers and made the obvious choice. Why pay extra for a temperamental racing engine when you could get better performance from Pontiac's proven Street Fighter? The Boss 429's exclusivity became a liability rather than an asset. Ford quietly killed the Boss 429 program after 1970, officially blaming emissions regulations and insurance concerns. Unofficially, they'd realized they'd built a magnificent engine in the wrong car for the wrong market at the wrong price. The GTO Judge succeeded because Pontiac understood something Ford missed. Muscle car buyers wanted cars that looked wild, sounded mean, and could back up their aggressive appearance with legitimate performance. The Judge delivered on all three counts. Pontiac built 6,833 Judges in 1969 and 3,797 more in 1970, making it far more successful than Ford's exclusive approach. The Judge proved you could build an outrageous-looking car with serious performance at reasonable prices, and the market rewarded that honesty. The Judge also aged better than the Boss 429. While Ford's racing engine became increasingly temperamental as emissions regulations tightened, Pontiac's street-oriented approach meant the Judge remained drivable and reliable throughout its production run. Today's collector car market tells an interesting story about both approaches. A good Boss 429 brings $200,000 to $300,000 at auction, partly because of rarity, and partly because collectors love the NASCAR mystique. A comparable Judge brings $60,000 to $90,000. Serious money, but significantly less than the Boss. Here's the irony that muscle car enthusiasts still debate. The less valuable car was actually the better performer. The Judge could outrun the Boss in most real-world situations while costing less to buy, maintain, and insure. But the Boss 429's rarity and racing heritage make it more collectible today. The ultimate showdown between Ford's most expensive dream and Pontiac's wildest reality. The Boss 429 was a magnificent piece of engineering that failed as a street car because Ford forgot the most important thing. It actually had to be fast when you pressed the throttle. The GTO Judge was everything great about the muscle car era rolled into one outrageous package. Honest performance, reasonable pricing, and the willingness to be completely over the top. It proved you could build a car that looked like a Hot Wheels fantasy and still deliver legitimate speed. Which philosophy speaks to you? Do you prefer the Boss 429's exclusive appeal and racing pedigree, even knowing it couldn't back up its reputation on the street? Or do you respect the Judge's honest performance and in-your-face attitude, despite looking like it escaped from a comic book? Let us know in the comments, and get ready for a debate that's been raging since 1970. If this showdown taught you something new about what really mattered in the muscle car wars, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Next week, we're diving into the legendary Hemi versus big block Chevy battles that defined an entire generation of drag racing. Thanks for riding along, and remember, in the muscle car world, the most expensive car isn't always the fastest car.